Hello and welcome to Intentional Photography. In this video I'm being really intentional. Today I want to talk about fine art photography. How does one go about creating fine art photography? Does it require a specific technique or particular equipment? For that matter, what is fine art photography and who gets to decide? Some folks say photography in general can't be art because a gadget captures the image. To that I ask you, how is a photographer's camera different from a sculptor's chisel or a painter's brush? By that logic, only finger painting and molded clay of one sort or another can qualify as art. Now, if you search the term fine art photography, Wikipedia, that bastion of knowledge, will give you this definition, and I quote, "Fine art photography is photography created in line with the vision of the photographer as artist, using photography as a medium for creative expression. The goal of fine art photography is to express an idea, a message, or an emotion," and it continues. But if you dig a little deeper, the Encyclopedia of Art, which I think should be a bit more on point, states, known also as photographic art, artistic photography, and so on, the term fine art photography has no universally agreed meaning or definition. Now, if I may interject, isn't that interesting? No one has defined it, but apparently some folks are experts on the subject. How does that work? Anyway, continuing with the quote, "Rather, it refers to an imprecise category of photographs created in accordance with the creative vision of the photographer. The basic idea behind the genre is that instead of merely capturing a realistic rendition of the subject, the photographer is aiming to produce a more personal, typically more evocative or atmospheric impression. One might simplify this by saying that fine art photography describes anything taken by a camera where the intention is aesthetic rather than scientific, commercial, or journalistic." End of quote. Now, some folks view this at the height of achievement. Reach this pinnacle and your images will be displayed in galleries all over the world. For a great many, it requires that the image is in black and white. Obviously, any discerning eye must realize color images couldn't possibly be art. Or could they? Now, actually, I believe in recent years that prejudice has waned. Now, you may ask, why am I troubling myself with this genre? Why aren't I outside doing close-up work? That does seem to be a bit of my preference of late, but most of that's due to this lockdown. But back to why fine art photography. Well, for a few reasons. The main reason is that this type of photography is not dependent on the weather, and it doesn't necessarily require special equipment. In the example I am about to relate, although I have portable professional lighting, I used a simple desk lamp which was already on site. Some months ago, I was commissioned to do an image for an office using the theme hands. That's all I got. Everything else was at my discretion. My only real clue as to a proper image was that the individual in question works with their hands, but not in the traditional sense. So where to start? As coincidental as it may seem, about that time, my best friend of over 30 years took down an old brass ship's chronograph to give it a good going over. He just happened to mention this to me in passing. Clock hands, cleaning, adjustment. You've got to use your hands. The germ of an idea began to take place. I considered the idea of using the clock as a prop and my friend as the model. I discussed it with him, and so the project began. Now, this image was to take pride of place as one of the main displays in my client's business. What should it be? Black and white? Color? Which lens? 28? 35? 50 millimeter? Definitely something with a shallow depth of field. What light source? Constant or strobe? I was uncertain, but I figured the image would speak for itself once I was behind the camera. On the day, I joined my friend for breakfast and a quick trip to a local state park to get the day off to a good start. Then it was back to his house to start the project. After a good deal of trial and error and 3 lenses and at least that many setups, I felt I had some shots to work with, but I had no idea what post-production would hold. Now, a small apology before I continue. This project was completed months before I began my YouTube channel. In fact, the very thought of a channel hadn't even entered my head at that point. As a result, there aren't enough images to completely fill out the story the way I tell it, so they may seem somewhat disjointed. Hopefully you can enjoy the images and follow the story at the same time. By the way, only the black and white image has been put through post-processing, and the final image was cropped to a 4:5 ratio, and yes, there were a few where I blurred my friend's face. He'd rather remain anonymous. Everything else is straight out of camera. At this point, let me refer to the images as I finish my story. We first began with a trial run without cleaning off the workbench. I took my camera out of the bag and set up my tripod. After a few shots, I realized the 18-270 wasn't going to do the job. Obviously, it had the focal length, but it didn't have an f-stop open enough to give me the short depth of field I was looking for. Just that morning, I had been given a vintage 28mm f2.8 lens. It wasn't even in my bag yet. I grabbed that from the car and mounted it on the camera. After a few frames, I could tell this one had possibilities. We cleaned off the bench and I started the project in earnest. I wasn't 100% convinced, but in my mind I was very much leaning toward a monochrome image, so I started composing the image with that in mind. Who knew that the placement of a screwdriver on the bench or the choice of needle-nose pliers would make such a difference? I knew I needed a model, but not an identifiable model, even after the fact. I wanted an individual, but the focus was the hands. After all, that was the commission. I found that shooting slightly over the shoulder with the model facing the chronograph was the best combination. After several frames in slightly different poses, I felt like there was something in the camera I could work with in post-production. I just wasn't sure which one. With that accomplished, I pulled out my vintage 50mm f1.4 Nikkor. There's no telling how old this lens is. So now you're asking yourself, why is this guy making such a big deal about vintage lenses? Well, for one thing, they're relatively inexpensive, readily available, and if you know what you're doing, they really work. I've mentioned several times I began in photography shooting film with a fully manual camera. It's second nature for me to use these older lenses. Don't get me wrong, I really like my contemporary auto everything primes too, but they don't give the same look as the vintage glass. I think maybe it's because the vintage stuff was designed to shoot film, or perhaps it's something in the older coatings that makes the difference. Whatever the case, they have a character all their own, and I really like it. If you're wondering who Quanta-Ray is, they were the house brand of a chain called Ritz or Wolf camera stores that went out of business in 2012. Many of those lenses were made by Tamron or Sigma. Enough nostalgia. Let's get back to the story. I got the 50mm set up and we did a bit of rearranging. After all, there was less in the frame now. And f1.4 made a rock-solid lockdown an absolute necessity. Not the tripod, the hands. A twitch would make the difference between in or out of focus. Fortunately, my friend is also a marksman, so holding steady was second nature. As you can see, we took several images with tools and hands in different positions until it seemed again, surely there must be something to work with in the camera. I packed up, finished my visit, and headed home. It was the next day before I got the images onto the computer and into the software. It was apparent the 28mm shots were going to require a good deal of post-processing. I needed to digitally hide some of the stains on the wood and some of the tools in the background. This was going to need to be really low-key, but that was part of my original intention. Focus on the hands. I'll have to admit it took several attempts to get everything like I wanted it to be. And then, just when I thought I was finished and had it converted to a lossless JPEG, I noticed that one more thing. A flyaway tuft of beard needed to be addressed. Details, details. The devil is in the details. Finally, with that last distraction cloned away, I felt I had a decent image to present to my client. But I still hadn't addressed the 50mm shots. The commission was fulfilled. This was all mine. Now I had in mind something in color, and I hoped for something I could use. I opened the folder and browsed through the images, and then there it was. I opened it in post-processing, but I couldn't find any adjustment that made it better. Perhaps just a slight crop, but I wasn't even sure of that. Straight out of the camera, I'd nailed it. We'd been using a 3200K compact fluorescent bulb that hadn't mattered in monochrome, and to the human eye it just translated as white light. But in color, its warm tones captured on the camera were exactly what was needed. Okay, I'd worked my way through different lenses, different apertures, different poses. I'd used my several years of photographic experience, but when it came down to it, at least part of what I considered one of my best images was thanks to a light bulb. The moral of the story: learn your equipment, know its limitations and its advantages, develop your eye for what makes a good image, learn to make your ideas into reality. Then shoot, 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 and keep on shooting. In this digital age, you're only using up battery power, and those are rechargeable. Sometimes your best images may be purely by accident, but never admit it.